will remove all U.S. products from its shelves and wholesale catalog. Starting today, and until U.S. tariffs are removed.
Imagine waking up to breaking news that Canada is considering cutting off every single United States fast food chain, a move triggered not only by economic tension but by rising political anger after former President Donald Trump openly referred to Canada as the 51st state of the United States. This is no longer just a dispute about burgers, coffee, or fried chicken. It is now a symbol of a deeper fracture between two nations whose economies are tied together through more than 700 billion United States dollars in cross-border trade each year. Canada may be home to only 38 million people, but it is one of the most strategically important international markets for American giants such as McDonald's, Starbucks, Burger King, Domino's, and Taco Bell. And Canadians spend more than 41 billion Canadian dollars annually in the quick service restaurant sector, a significant portion of which flows directly into American corporate revenue streams. If Canada moves forward with a full shutdown, what looks like a restaurant issue could quickly spread into agriculture, logistics, technology, and even diplomatic retaliation. And behind the scenes, a much bigger question emerges. Could this be the start of a real trade conflict between two of the closest partners in the world? Keep watching, because the deeper we dig, the more shocking the consequences become. Canada's consideration of shutting down every American fast food brand immediately exposes the scale of disruption hidden beneath what appears to be a simple commercial dispute. The United States fast food presence in Canada is connected to a complex chain of suppliers, agricultural producers, cross-border transport operators, freight companies, software vendors, and food processing facilities spread across dozens of American states. Once this chain is disrupted, the impact becomes far larger than the closing of recognizable storefronts. American agricultural sectors would face one of the earliest and sharpest blows. A significant share of Canadian quick service restaurant demand is supplied by farms and processors in the northern regions of the United States, particularly for beef, potatoes, cooking oils, packaging materials, industrial kitchen equipment, and frozen foods. If Canada suddenly removes American fast food chains from the market, suppliers in the United States could lose contracts worth billions of United States dollars. That level of supply shock forces factories to slow production, triggers layoffs in vulnerable counties, and undermines regional economic stability. This scenario also places financial markets under stress. Investors monitoring multinational restaurant corporations would suddenly see an entire national market erased from the revenue outlook. In previous moments of geopolitical uncertainty, even minor disruptions have erased tens of billions of United States dollars in market capitalization. A full Canadian shutdown would raise questions about political risk, regulatory retaliation, and the possibility that other nations could reinterpret American brands as tools of foreign policy. In an era where trade war tensions have already strained global commerce, the psychological effect alone could be costly. But the most severe consequence is the potential shift in diplomatic posture. Once a major American economic symbol is pushed out of Canada, Washington may feel compelled to respond. Under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement framework, policymakers can argue that discriminatory restrictions violate the principles of fair access. That opens the door to tariffs targeting Canadian exports such as lumber, aluminum, dairy, and processed foods. And because Canada sends roughly 3/4 of its exports to the United States, even a modest tariff wave could destabilize entire industries. As each layer unfolds, the situation becomes less about restaurants and more about the fragility of a relationship that has been stable for decades. And the most unsettling part is this. Analysts believe the fast food shutdown might only be the first move in a much larger economic confrontation. What that next move could be is far more alarming than anyone expects, the revelation that changes the entire conversation. The removal of every American fast food chain from Canada would trigger a nationwide consumer shift unlike anything seen in the country's modern retail history. For millions of Canadian households, quick service restaurants are not simply indulgent conveniences. They are part of daily routines that rely on speed, affordability, and predictable pricing. Once these options disappear, the immediate effect is a tightening of household budgets and a rapid reorganization of consumer behavior. Canadian families would face higher menu prices as domestic brands struggle to absorb the sudden spike in demand. Many Canadian fast food alternatives lack the enormous scale, automation capacity, and centralized supply chain efficiency that American giants have developed over decades. When demand overwhelms capacity, restaurants raise prices. That pressure quickly spreads to groceries, delivery services, and local suppliers. Analysts note that economic shocks of this type often produce second-layer inflation, where even unrelated food sectors experience cost escalation. The demographic most affected is the Canadian youth labor force. A significant portion of entry-level employment in the quick-service restaurant industry is filled by individuals under 25 years old. When American chains leave the market, tens of thousands of part-time and full-time positions vanish. Although domestic brands may expand to fill the gap, the pace of hiring cannot match the speed of disruption. This leads to higher youth unemployment, slower wage growth, and reduced spending at retail stores, entertainment venues, and transportation services. Another overlooked factor is the impact on rural and suburban regions. In many smaller Canadian towns, American fast food chains are among the few reliable anchor businesses that draw daily foot traffic. Their disappearance weakens surrounding retail zones, hurting small businesses that depend on spillover customers. Economic studies of anchor store closures in the past show that entire local economies can contract for years if a major traffic generator shuts down. The social consequence goes beyond economics. Losing a familiar set of food choices creates psychological pressure, reinforcing an us versus them narrative in a moment where political tension between Canada and the United States is already escalating. That sentiment influences how consumers behave in other markets, including technology purchases, automotive choices, and even travel decisions. A single disruption in fast food can ripple into a nationwide consumer realignment that policymakers cannot easily reverse. And underneath that shift lies a more dangerous pattern. Once Canadian consumers break away from American brands, they may never fully return, even if diplomatic tensions ease. That irreversible behavioral change is what alarms trade analysts the most. What nobody is prepared for, however, is the way American businesses will be forced into a chain reaction far more explosive than the Canadian consumer shock. When a country the size of Canada abruptly removes American fast food brands, corporations headquartered in the United States face a convergence of economic shocks that hit multiple layers of their business models simultaneously. The first and most obvious impact is lost revenue, but deeper inside the operational structure, the damage becomes exponentially more severe. Multinational restaurant corporations rely on international markets to stabilize their long-term growth forecasts. When a country is suddenly removed from that portfolio, global revenue projections shift downward in an instant. That shift triggers recalculations by institutional investors, pension funds, asset managers, and credit rating agencies. These players do not react only to the loss of revenue itself, they react to the signal it sends. If Canada can expel American brands during a political dispute, what prevents other nations from using the same strategy as a bargaining tool? That fear alone has historically wiped tens of billions of United States dollars from corporate valuations during previous episodes of geopolitical uncertainty. The next shockwave hits the United States supply chain. Factories, warehouses, and processing plants in the northern border states depend heavily on Canadian demand. When that demand collapses, production lines slow, procurement contracts shrink, and logistics firms lose predictable shipping volume. Counties that rely on cross-border trade experience rising unemployment, shrinking tax revenue, and reduced investment inflows. American agricultural sectors feel the pressure as well, especially in states producing beef, potatoes, and packaged foods that were previously guaranteed stable cross-border buyers. As corporations struggle to maintain profitability, they begin reallocating budgets, delaying expansions, cutting research and development spending, and freezing non-essential hiring. The long-term consequence is the erosion of competitive strength, especially against foreign rivals who may use the disruption to capture market share in both Canada and other regions. When major American brands stumble internationally, competitors from Asia and Europe often accelerate their expansion into the same markets. This corporate vulnerability introduces a broader geopolitical dilemma. If American brands appear economically fragile, foreign governments may interpret the moment as an opportunity to test the resilience of the United States in other sectors. Analysts who study global power competition warn that economic signals of weakness can be just as consequential as military ones, reshaping how allies and adversaries calculate risk. And the most alarming insight emerging from early economic modeling is this. The fast food shutdown may trigger a chain reaction that does not stop at revenue, labor, or supply chains. It may unlock a strategic vulnerability inside the United States economy that has gone unnoticed for decades. What that vulnerability is will fundamentally change how viewers think about the stability of North American trade. For policymakers in Washington, the sudden removal of American fast food chains from Canada represents far more than a commercial setback. It forces the United States government into a strategic corner. If the administration responds too aggressively, it risks triggering a regional trade war with its closest ally. If it responds too weakly, it may appear unable or unwilling to protect American commercial interests abroad. In global politics, perception is leverage, and leverage shapes how other nations treat the United States. Inside the United States Congress, the political reaction would be immediate. Lawmakers from agricultural and manufacturing states would pressure the White House to retaliate through the tools historically used in trade disputes: tariffs, regulatory barriers, and targeted restrictions on Canadian goods. Tariffs applied even at modest levels could upend key Canadian export categories such as softwood lumber, aluminum, beef products, and processed foods. Analysts studying the inflation ripple of past tariff rounds note that every new layer of trade friction raises input costs for American construction firms, automotive suppliers, and consumer goods companies. The United States Trade Representative would face intense scrutiny from business associations, labor unions, and industry coalitions demanding clarity on Canada's motives. If the Canadian decision is framed as a discriminatory action, Washington has grounds to challenge it under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. That process, however, is slow, politically charged, and often accompanied by retaliatory measures while arbitration unfolds. The mere initiation of such a dispute shifts the tone of bilateral relations from cooperation to confrontation. Diplomatically, American allies observe how Washington defends its commercial icons. If the United States appears passive while an advanced partner like Canada imposes such a drastic action, other nations may interpret it as a signal that American brands are fair targets in future disputes. This perception erodes the global confidence that supports the international operations of hundreds of United States corporations. Every commercial challenge abroad, whether in Europe, Asia, or Latin America, depends on the assumption that Washington stands behind its companies. Complicating matters further, retaliation does not occur in isolation. Each time the United States levels a countermeasure, Canada must respond domestically to avoid appearing submissive. Political leaders in Ottawa cannot ignore public sentiment. Thus, a single economic escalation often produces a chain of politically motivated replies, widening the conflict. Trade war historians have documented repeatedly that once escalation begins, both sides find themselves trapped, even when neither nation wants the confrontation to continue. And beneath the surface, United States strategists fear something even more destabilizing: the possibility that Canada's decision emboldens other nations to test Washington's economic red lines in entirely different sectors. Around the globe, governments closely examine how the United States manages conflicts with its allies, because those behaviors signal how future disputes might be handled. Canada's rejection of American fast food brands sends a deeply symbolic message to international observers. Even the closest partner of the United States is willing to challenge American economic presence. That narrative carries profound implications for global commerce. European policymakers already navigating delicate trade questions with Washington may view this moment as validation that American corporate influence has weak points. nations negotiating digital services taxes, agricultural quotas, or competition regulations could become more assertive, believing the United States is facing multiple fronts of economic stress. This shift in attitude influences how they approach everything from automotive standards to renewable energy supply chains. Meanwhile, competitors in Asia monitor the situation for opportunities. Countries seeking to reduce American influence might use the fast food dispute as justification for limiting American brands in their own markets. When one nation demonstrates that major American corporations can be excluded during political disagreement, others may adopt similar strategies. Such actions do not require formal bans. Governments can use regulatory delays, licensing obstacles, or domestic preference policies to achieve the same effect while avoiding direct confrontation. Foreign investors also analyze the moment through a geopolitical lens. If bilateral ties between the United States and Canada can deteriorate rapidly, multinationals question the long-term stability of operating in North America. This uncertainty affects capital flows, infrastructure investment, and labor planning. Economists who study risk premiums warn that instability between the two largest economies on the continent could reprice North American trade routes for years. United States allies such as Japan, South Korea, and the United Kingdom pay close attention to whether Washington responds with measured discipline or emotional retaliation. Their evaluation influences defense cooperation, technology partnerships, and supply chain integration, areas where credibility is vital. If the United States overreacts, allies may worry about being dragged into broader conflicts. If the United States underreacts, allies may doubt Washington's resolve when defending their shared economic interests. Yet, the most consequential reaction may come from countries that do not align with the United States. They could interpret this dispute as an invitation to test American resilience. If even Canada challenges American commercial presence, nations with adversarial intentions may escalate their own economic experiments, probing weaknesses in technology, pharmaceuticals, and manufacturing. And analysts warn of something far more ominous. The world may soon witness the first visible signal that North American economic stability, long considered untouchable, is beginning to fracture. That fracture could open the door to a scenario so disruptive that even seasoned experts hesitate to describe it publicly. What that scenario entails will fundamentally alter how viewers understand the future of United States power. A fast food shutdown inside Canada may appear at first glance to be a consumer-level conflict, yet its long-term implications reach deep into the structural foundations of North American commerce. Once a disruption of this scale enters the political arena, the United States begins reassessing the architecture of its economic relationship with Canada, not only in food systems but across energy, technology, manufacturing, and transportation. This reassessment is not optional. It is triggered by the fear that Canada's decision represents a precedent. If a close ally can weaponize market access in a moment of political frustration, other nations might replicate the tactic. In response, policymakers in Washington would likely accelerate a strategic pivot that has already begun quietly inside federal economic planning circles: the push for greater domestic resilience. This includes relocating food processing plants, expanding domestic agricultural capacity, and cultivating internal supply redundancy that reduces exposure to sudden foreign policy shocks. These moves may benefit some American states, but they also increase production costs and weaken the efficiency that North American integration once provided. Canada, facing growing uncertainty in its relationship with the United States, might undertake its own restructuring. Ottawa could strengthen food sovereignty policies, create incentives for domestic quick-service restaurant brands to scale rapidly, and diversify import sources toward Europe or Asia. In sectors where Canada depends heavily on American suppliers, such as industrial equipment, packaging materials, and agricultural innovations, political leaders may encourage the creation of parallel supply chains that cannot be disrupted by a trade war. These structural shifts do not unfold quietly. They create a permanent reordering of investment flows, labor, mobility, and manufacturing incentives. Historically, once nations embark on economic separation, returning to full integration takes decades, often requiring conditions of extreme external pressure to rebuild trust. When the United States and Canada begin designing their supply chains around the possibility of future conflict rather than the assumption of cooperation, every industry, from automotive manufacturing to medical equipment, absorbs the cost of political unpredictability. What makes this moment particularly consequential is that the restructuring may not remain limited to North America. Other countries watch closely and adjust their own national strategies. If they perceive Canada's action as proof that American brands can be pressured, they may prepare for a world where global supply chains must function independently of United States influence. And that perception alone has the power to redirect investment across continents. But beneath the surface of these shifts lies an even more critical challenge: the psychological unraveling of economic trust, a force that can reshape alliances more deeply than any tariff ever could. Beyond the economic adjustments, the long-term political consequences carry even greater weight. When Canada publicly rejects a major sector of American commerce, it alters how both populations view their national identities. Economic nationalism in Canada strengthens, while American voters grow more sensitive to perceived disrespect from a country long viewed as a reliable partner. This emotional shift becomes a powerful driver of political behavior on both sides of the border. Inside the United States, political leaders may use the Canadian shutdown as evidence that allies cannot be trusted unconditionally. That narrative reshapes debates about energy independence, agricultural policy, and foreign investment rules. If public pressure intensifies, future administrations may feel compelled to revisit the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, renegotiate rules of origin, or impose new tariffs that permanently redesign the flow of goods across the continent. What began as a conflict over fast food can escalate into a profound redefinition of North American integration. Meanwhile, the international community interprets the event as a landmark moment. Nations that historically avoided direct confrontation with the United States may test Washington's willingness to defend other industries. Competitors with adversarial intentions may use the Canadian example as leverage in negotiations over technology access, pharmaceutical licensing, or data governance. Each test chips away at the perception of American commercial invulnerability, a perception that has shaped global economic behavior for nearly a century. For Canada, the shift cuts in two directions. On one hand, breaking away from overly dominant American brands may strengthen sectors that benefit from new domestic demand. On the other hand, provoking the world's largest economy always carries cost. Tariffs, retaliatory consumer boycotts, and the realignment of capital flows can reduce national growth for years. Economists warn that confrontations between tightly linked economies often leave both sides weakened, especially when the conflict influences public sentiment rather than only policy decisions. The most alarming dimension is the potential for permanent realignment. Once trust is damaged, nations begin treating each other not as automatic partners but as conditional allies. That recalibration affects military cooperation, intelligence sharing, energy integration, and long-term infrastructure planning. A single symbolic economic rupture can create ripple effects that last generations. And according to several geopolitical analysts, the most profound consequence is still hidden. Canada's fast food shutdown may unintentionally expose a structural vulnerability deep inside the United States economy, one that no administration has prepared for, and one that could redefine power in North America in ways the public has not yet imagined. What that vulnerability is and why it could reshape the balance between the United States and Canada will be revealed in the next section. As policymakers in Washington and Ottawa scramble to respond to the economic shock, a deeper strategic recalibration quietly unfolds. Both the United States and Canada begin reviewing long-term national strategies that were, for decades, built on the assumption that economic cooperation across the border would never face existential threats. This assumption now collapses. Inside the United States, discussions emerge about creating a multi-tiered economic defense model that mirrors the frameworks used in global energy security. The objective is clear: reduce vulnerability to political decisions made by any single partner, even one as historically trusted as Canada. This means incentivizing domestic production of agricultural ingredients, expanding federal support for food processing facilities, and strengthening regulatory control over foreign suppliers linked to essential industries. What was once a seamless North American food ecosystem slowly evolves into a system of strategic buffers designed to function during prolonged political conflict. Canada, witnessing Washington's increasingly defensive posture, explores its own shift. Leaders in Ottawa begin considering whether the nation should build stronger economic ties with Europe and Asia, reducing overdependence on the United States. In a landscape dominated by geopolitical competition, diversification becomes a survival strategy. The European Union market offers technology partnerships and regulatory alignment, while Asian markets offer scale and demand growth. A Canada that once placed nearly 3/4 of its exports into the United States now maps out contingency channels that bypass American influence entirely. These strategic shifts carry long-lasting consequences. Once a nation restructures its supply chains for political protection, reversing that structure becomes nearly impossible. Investment flows harden, national identity narratives solidify, and industries adjust to the new incentives, often at the cost of the efficiency and economic synergy that once defined North American trade. But even as both nations attempt to redefine their long-term strategies, a far more consequential problem emerges, one hidden inside the American economic system itself. Behind the public debate over fast food chains and consumer prices lies a structural weakness that few analysts have dared to confront. The United States economy, despite its enormous scale, has grown increasingly reliant on the stability of its closest allies to maintain predictable supply chains. Canada, supplying critical commodities such as crude oil, fertilizer, natural gas liquids, mineral components, and food ingredients, forms a backbone of the American industrial system. If political tensions escalate and a trade war environment begins to take shape, the United States faces a risk far more severe than lost franchise revenue: the risk of strategic dependency disruption. While the United States holds tremendous global influence, many of its essential industries depend on uninterrupted Canadian inputs to maintain production stability. A conflict-driven reduction in those inputs, whether through tariffs, licensing conflicts, or regulatory deflection, would directly hit American transportation networks, agricultural sectors, construction supply chains, and even defense-related manufacturing components. Economists warn that the United States has, for years, underestimated the national security role of Canadian imports because the relationship was assumed to be unbreakable. The fast food shutdown exposes that assumption as dangerously outdated. If Canada chooses to apply pressure in areas far beyond food, energy, minerals, transportation corridors, the United States could face disruptions that ripple into fuel pricing, electricity stability, fertilizer costs, and heavy manufacturing output. This is the vulnerability few citizens recognize. The United States, a nation often perceived as economically self-sufficient, is in reality deeply tied to the reliability of Canadian supply flows. And once political conflict enters that equation, even small disruptions can become system-level threats. The revelation is stark. A symbolic commercial confrontation has exposed the possibility that a close ally could unintentionally compromise the internal stability of the United States economy, not through hostile action, but through the cascading effects of political miscalculation. But this leads to a final unsettling question, one that experts are increasingly reluctant to answer publicly. If the removal of American fast food chains can expose such vulnerabilities, what happens if Canada escalates its response beyond the commercial sector entirely? The answer to that question changes everything about how the future of North American power is understood. The confrontation between the United States and Canada over the removal of American fast food brands has evolved into something far larger than a consumer dispute. What started as a symbolic act now reveals the immense fragility woven into the modern economic partnership that connects both nations. When commercial channels are disrupted, political pressure rises. When political pressure rises, the risk of tariffs, retaliation, and structural divergence becomes unavoidable. And once divergence begins, rebuilding trust can take generations. For Washington, the challenge is not only economic, it is strategic. Every international partner is watching closely to see whether the United States defends its commercial footprint with confidence or reacts with hesitation. For Ottawa, the stakes are equally high. A miscalculated step could trigger consequences that weaken national industries, investment flows, and long-term competitiveness. In a world where trade war tensions are growing, even long-standing allies must navigate carefully. The real question now is whether this moment becomes a temporary clash or the first chapter of a deeper shift in North American power. Because if Canada expands its pressure beyond the commercial realm, the consequences could reach levels no analyst has fully mapped. So, is this a bold strategy or a risky mistake for the United States?